Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are you feeling today? Excellent. It must have been the dinner last night, right? Yeah, so good morning. So we're going to start. It's 9 o'clock. I first wanted to thank you again for yesterday, all the speakers, the panelists, everyone who participated in discussions in the room or in the breaks. Personally, I think we had a great day yesterday. I'm very happy with how things turned out. So that's excellent. So before we start today, I just have a few little practical things to tell you. First, to remind you about the safety. So we're not expecting any tests of the alarms today. So if we have an alarm, we need to evacuate. And we can do that through basically all of these doors here in this room. We go out past the reception and down, and then we meet on the square here in front at Starbucks or outside of Starbucks. And I know that some people here in the room, I won't mention you by name, but have already visited Starbucks. So we know that some of you know where it is. So follow those colleagues. The other thing is that many of you are checking out today or leaving. So if you have bags with you, we prefer that you put them in the cloakroom. So it's just through that door there, and we have someone sitting in the cloakroom the whole day. So your bags will be safe there as well. Last practical things. Most of the presentations from yesterday, some need to be adjusted a little bit before they are posted, are available now on the website, on our public website, but also in the app. And I know Alistair is putting also all the pictures from yesterday's sessions there, not yet from the dinner and so on, but from all the sessions are there. So that's interesting, in particular, of course, for the speakers and so on who want to use them for various posts and stuff. And I think that's it for me. So I'll hand over to my colleague, Felipe. Oh yeah, here's the app again. But I hope you all have downloaded it. But if you haven't, maybe I'll leave this on for 30 seconds for you to scan the QR code. All right. So let's start.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. I'm Felipe, MACIEL, Manager of Environment at worldsteel. I think yesterday we had a good segue into the session today. We finished that discussion talking about methodologies and need for interoperability, and I think that's what we're going to bring up this morning as well. Not just this session, but the one after as well. We're using this analogy of a film, right, for a movie for the decarbonization in this event. And here we're saying that the aligned methodologies serve as a script that we are all reading from and talking together. But I also think that there's a different analogy even that we can consider. If we're doing a movie about decarbonization in 2 hours, if we're talking about methodology in that movie, we're going to lose the audience. So it's probably a good moment for a montage, upbeat music, some people working in Excel, and then high-fiving at the end. But unfortunately, or fortunately, we are actually the ones actually doing the work, so we need to get actually to the details. So let's do that. And this is just a very non-exhaustive timeline. I could have added so many more names here, but just to show that this is not a new topic, but it is a topic that's exploding a bit in the last 5 to 10 years. worldsteel has been doing work on this since the 90s. So we started our LCA program in 95, followed up by the GHG CO2, now renamed as GHG methodology in 2007. Those two initiatives, we've been collecting data based on them and evolving those standards throughout that time. And they also were used as a basis for a couple of ISO standards that are also used in the industry. In the beginning, in the 90s, like I think it was mentioned yesterday, that the effort or the focus on this was for the experts. So it was an analysis of sustainability, but now the focus is going to value chain, accounting, market differentiation, and you can see that the purple elements there are just blowing up in the last 5 or 10 years. It's a good it's a good indicator that there is interest, but it's also, okay, if you have so many different initiatives, so many labels, how can you decide which one to trust? And that's the thing that we need to tackle now. The OECD has been doing some work on this, basically with the Climate Club and with the IFCMA. I forgot the I, but yeah, carbon mitigation approaches. And they did a breakdown of, with the assumption that full harmonization is not always possible. We can't really reach full harmonization. There are some differences between regions and some pathways that are being taken in each location. But interoperability is considered critical. And they break it down into 4 components of interoperability. So first, coverage, which is just deciding which gases to cover, which sectors to cover, which reporting boundaries to cover. Estimation method, so that will be between measurement-based, calculation-based. Then we go to verification framework, so how do you assure that that number is correct? And then concerns about data availability, threshold, cutoff points, which is something that we haven't worked a lot on, but WorldSteel and its members and different initiatives, we've been doing a lot of work, especially on the component number 1 and component number 2 already. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But the recommendations that come up in this report are focused on disaggregation and transformability when harmonization is not possible, and mutual recognition when that's possible. So let's talk about some options and what WorldSteel has been doing about that. First, internally, like I mentioned before, we have 2 programs. We have the LCI data collection program, which is a product-focused one, aligned with the ISO 20915 standard, which is also being revised right now. And there are some topics that we are addressing, or having that discussion within WorldSteel to keep those 2 aligned and up to date to current necessities. But also the GHG methodology. We did a review last year where we published a new indicator adding methane and N2O, which is something that was gravely missing from this methodology. So they're both ongoing and evolving as the necessities arise. But there are also commonalities between them. As we discussed yesterday, sometimes you have methodologies that are going from product focus to site focus. How do you bridge the gap between those 2? And in WorldSteel, we're proposing a new committee, so the Sustainability Assessment Methodologies Committee that will be looking into that, which is just bringing all those initiatives in under the same roof. And further on, we can also think, can that data collection be integrated in shared systems so that the data can be building blocks that can allow for different perspectives? So that's something it's quite an exciting work that we're doing internally in WorldSteel. But we're also doing work with the broader community. That's largely focused on the Steel Standards Principles. It was an initiative launched in COP28, so 3 years ago. It's a coalition of 60 endorsing organizations and established itself as a place for that discussion to take place. All the endorsing organizations recognize the need for interoperability, but it's how to get there. But it's not, the SSP, as we call it, it's not, there's no governing body, or there's no mandate to actually implement those. So it's a place for the discussion to take place, and then the individual organizations need to carry that forward. But maybe that needs to change. There is urgency, we need to actually implement those. So how can we make the Steel Standards Principles be more actionable going forward? But what has been done there, we started with the basics. First, shared statements, so common agreement points between the endorsing organizations. Glossary, are we talking about the same things? Also methodology mapping, so just have a look at the current situation of methodologies. There is a table there with more than 50 and checking the significant aspects in which they differ from each other. And the most recent is the transparency form, which is an agreement on the minimum common points of reporting. So if you have different standards reporting, say for example, in a boundary that goes to crude steel, to hot rolled steel, or to finished products, can we agree that crude steel is the common minimum one? So if you're still reporting on hot rolled, then the minimum is crude steel, so you report both numbers so that the crude steel number will be comparable across. So that's one example that comes up in this transparency form, but there are also other aspects. More recently, so we're working on a visual representation of this. So this is available on the Steel Standards Principles website, and it's just an infographic just showing those aspects where you can click and see the discussion that's taking place in the Steel Standards Principle for each aspect of that. So please go ahead and have a look at the website. And also, if you're not aware of the Steel Standards Principles, please engage with us. We would love to have more organizations involved in endorsing that. But this also doesn't happen in a vacuum. This work, we need to recognize that you have multiple policies, multiple initiatives happening across other regionalities. So we need to recognize multiple pathways and work with these different regulatory frameworks, like we mentioned yesterday, the carbon pricing schemes. How do they interact with these methodologies for site-based or product-based accounting? How do we put that in practice to actually reach decarbonization or drive decisions that would drive decarbonization? And for a broader perspective, I'll invite now Dan Hayes on the stage. And please feel free to contact me, but we'll have a panel right after this focusing with some of these initiatives that are working on the interoperability aspects. But Dan, please.
Thank you, Felipe. I hope everyone's doing well this morning. I've just been asked to whet your appetites for a really good panel session that we will have after this. My name's Dan Hayes. I am the Low Emission Standards Lead at the Mission Possible Partnership / Industrial Transition Accelerator. And yeah, I'm just going to hopefully set us up for a good panel discussion and touching on methodologies. So looking at how the methodologies are setting the foundations for a clean and low carbon world. Just to introduce Mission Possible Partnership, we are an NGO that's looking to accelerate the deep decarbonization of the highest emitting sectors. So we work across steel, concrete, cement, aluminium, as well as ammonia, methanol, and sustainable aviation fuel. And we seek to mobilize industry, finance, governments, and civil society to achieve those goals. At the minute, we're very much focused on shifting announcements of new projects, announcements of new low-carbon production facilities to actual shovels in the ground, actual financial investment decisions. We have a broad target of around 800 new facilities up and running by 2030, with the broad goal of staying within the 1.5 degree aligned targets that we all set a number of years ago. The main way we're doing this at the minute is through the Industrial Transition Accelerator, or ITA. That was launched back at COP28 by UNFCCC, the COP28 presidency, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. And again, the mission here is very much focused on achieving financial investment decision for these projects in the ground. We have an ITA Leadership Council, which worldsteel is part of, as well as many other industry associations from across the sectors that I mentioned, as well as organizations like the IEA, UNIDO, the International Maritime Organization. And at the minute, we're focusing our work in the MENA region, so countries like the UAE, Egypt, as well as Brazil, India. And we're also looking through other funding mechanisms at work on green steel and green iron in the Asia-Pacific region, so trade between Australia and Japan, Korea, and China, and looking at EU lead markets. So how can we develop the demand pool that we need for these projects to get financial investment decision? And I'll touch a little bit more on that shortly. We work both with the projects themselves on the ground and the governments looking at the different barriers, but we also work on the global enabling conditions through policies and, of course, standards, of which methodologies are a big part. And so why are these enabling conditions so important? Well, I'm sure many of you know, we need to be able to measure our progress, measure where we are coming from and where we're going, and understand how well we're doing or not. We need to be able to differentiate between different products so that we can help decision makers procure the right products. And we need to enable, hopefully sometime down the road, frictionless trade. And so what do we need these standards to be in order to facilitate those goals? We need them to be comprehensive and accurate, that they're reflecting the true emissions impact of our activities. We need standards to be transparent and traceable so that we know exactly where things are coming from and who's using them. And we need the standards to be interoperable and comparable. I think the long-term goal, or the historic goal of harmonization, has perhaps been put to one side, particularly when you think about different standards being used for different purposes and different goals. But certainly interoperability is something that we can all hope to aim for, particularly because underlying all these standards is the same data. At the end of the day, the same data is going to be used. Maybe the methodologies are different, how you get to the final number is different, but the underlying data that your members, that steel producers have to collect effectively is the same regardless. Where we're focusing a lot on the minute is demand side. So we have a lot of projects around the world announcing, it's relatively easy to seem to announce a project, but actually getting certainty and getting investments and finance from banks is extremely challenging without guaranteed demand for your products. And so that's where there's been a big shift towards product level accounting methodologies, because that's how procurement is done. Things are bought in tons, in meters cubed, in liters. And so there's been a big shift recently towards product level accounting. We're starting to see that come through in certain government policies, such as green public procurement and the use of EPDs, which has been really, really good. And we have examples like the IDDI's Green Public Procurement Pledge, where governments can sign up to different levels, where they can first of all start reporting the information, collecting the data, and then actually reporting the impact of different products, and then use that information to set baselines for their local production facilities, and then actually start to embed low emission definitions and then procurement targets for both low emission steel and near zero steel. But what we're also starting to see, as the CBAM conversation yesterday alluded to, is that there are different asks of producers in terms of different data being needed to be supplied for different policies. And the EU is a great example of this. We have CBAM, we have the green public procurement policies coming through. We also have the construction product regulation and the ESPR eco-label coming through. So there's lots of different policies, and so we need to work together to basically ensure that governments are thinking about the different policies that they're developing in different departments and make sure those departments are talking to each other. But as I mentioned, probably what we need to do is have guidance for the data, because that's what's being used in all of these policies, and make sure that at least the data that's being collected and the practitioners coming up with these different LCAs policies are able to fulfill that. So I guess the key message there is that we want interoperability in the long run, and without interoperability, we are going to see a slow market uptake of low carbon products. Standards will continue to evolve. There's lots of different things going on in the world at the minute. We have developments in the SBTI. They're coming up with a new net zero corporate standard, very much looking at developing the guidance around scope 3 emissions, the role of credits, and the role of booking claim certificates or energy attribute certificates. We also have developments within the greenhouse gas protocol, looking particularly at renewable energy generation and then renewable energy consumption, where they're looking very much at the correlation between, is the renewable energy being used at the same time it's being produced, and are there physical constraints that mean that actually that renewable electricity isn't actually getting to where you're producing or claiming that you're producing a low carbon product. As mentioned yesterday, we have the Open Coalition for Compliance Carbon Markets, which is a broad initiative between the EU, Brazil, and China to at least have and start these pragmatic discussions about aligning carbon pricing. I believe Germany and New Zealand have also recently joined that, and that very much builds on the work at COP30. And then we also have the Greenhouse Gas and ISO partnership, which was announced last year, where they're looking to align both the corporate accounting standards and the product level standards, and making sure that product and corporate both talk to each other and one can be used to inform the other. That is also taking place within what is known as the activation agenda within the COP movement. And this activation agenda there's a whole stream of activities going on which are basically recognizing things that are happening outside of the actual negotiations, but are actually all about supporting the end goal of decarbonization. There is actually a group called the AG23 group, and the ISO GHG partnership activity is sort of being reported to that group, as well as a number of other initiatives. So there's lots going on. The ITA, in partnership with UNIDA, have also identified some other gaps, and we're actually looking at discussing this with ISO at the minute. Here's a lovely graph of some standards, and I won't go into the deep detail, but effectively what we have here is the family tree of ISO standards relating to carbon accounting methodologies. On your left-hand side, you've got product carbon footprinting, and on the right-hand side, you've got LCA, of which EPDs and the various PCRs are derived from. And what we have identified, and it's probably well known anyway, that there are slightly different approaches taken by these two very similar family trees. And we have put together a proposal that we're discussing with the ISO technical committees at the minute as to how to develop some guidance that would actually start to bring cohesion and a common approach across these two family trees. Because at the end of the day, the buyers aren't really interested in the nuances. They're not really interested in what ISO number we're talking about. What they want is it's confidence in the claim that's being made, and that the number that they are seeing on a piece of paper is truly reflective of the greenhouse gas emissions impact. If you're interested in this project, and please do come and speak to me. But I'd like to leave you with this final thought before the panel session. We don't need full harmonization, but interoperability is essential. And if anyone's put up a shelf recently at home or done any DIY, you'll probably recognize that we have a perfect case of interoperability here between inches and centimeters. So it is possible, and with a bit of goodwill and determination, we can get there. So with that, I will say thank you very much and leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. I will now just invite our panelists on the stage, please. We can have a discussion on, I think it's very good in your last message. I think that's the key driving discussion for us in the panel. We have 4 representatives of standard setting bodies. Of course, that's reductive in a way. They do a lot more work than that. So we have Annie from ResponsibleSteel, Tahmid from Carbon Measures, with a different name that came up from last year, Adina from GSCC, Yanet from the GHG protocol, and Nick representing the steel company. Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for joining. I think I would start with the first question, and I will just give a initial introduction question so you can talk about your initiative and what you're doing in this field for interoperability. And I think the GHG protocol and ISO partnership last year was one of the biggest announcements that was discussed heavily in COP. And it's also because these names, GHG protocol and ISO, are such big names in this field that them fully harmonizing, it's a great achievement, I think. So if you could, Yanet, please tell us more about this process, and especially bringing together 2 organizations with such different philosophies of work.
Sure, thank you. Hi everyone, I am Yanet REMPENING, and I'm coming from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, focused on the development of the product standards specifically, but I am also supporting in the project management of this partnership. And just to introduce the Greenhouse Gas Protocol briefly, we are an initiative that has been co-funded by 2 NGOs, the World Resource Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, 25 years ago. Our core topic, it has always been greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting. So since then, you saw the graph that Felipe showed just a few minutes ago. We have been working on developing standards and guidances just for this specific topic. And we've been doing this in a multi-stakeholder process. So really these two things, GHG emissions accounting and connecting with different stakeholders has been part of our DNA since the beginning. Now, ISO, on the other hand, they have been here for longer, more than 25 years, obviously, I think probably 70 years, and they have published over 26,000 standards. And within these standards, they have also a set of rules and standards and guidances that have been focused on greenhouse gas emissions and LCAs, which, again, you have heard about it already. So both organizations, they have been following these development. They have been seeing the fragmentation that has been happening in the market, and they've seen the problems that it has caused with the users, right? So being very confused about which one to use for which use case. And ultimately, the problem that this has been causing is that we are not reaching our goal, which is decarbonization, right? So both organizations came together to talk about how can we solve this? What can we do to, put our strengths together to create a solution? And this is how the partnership started. So the partnership is covering three main layers of GHG accounting: is the corporate, the project, and the product standards. And it's not just about updating the standards, it's about creating a system that works, that it's not just about harmonizing GGP and ISO, but also across these three different levels, ensuring that it's interoperable, but it's also transparent. The methodology is also simple, it's credible, it's auditable. So all of different aspects, which obviously very complicated, but we have set this very high ambition for us because we do believe that we have the capabilities to do it. And just a few months after the announcement of the partnership, COP30 mandated both organizations, ISO and GGP, to lead the way to work on the, to create a common carbon accounting terminology. And well, this is what we've been working on, right? So just for a little bit of context. And so now going back to your question about where are we at right now. So in the very beginning, it was all about planning, right, and understanding how these two organizations work, because they are indeed very different. But I do want to highlight that there are still some similarities that we identified in the development processes. So it's been quite a few months right now, and we have all the teams that we needed set and running. So right now we are working on the working drafts for different standards, and also talking with each other to understand what has been the development so far, and also ensuring that there is no divergence in the methodologies, but actually the other way around. And on the challenges, again, because both organizations, they run very differently, one of the main challenges that we experienced was how do we, because both organizations, they need to still follow their own governance processes. So how can we make this work? How these differences can be put together in a way that we can still achieve our goals? And it has been challenging, but if anything that I can say right now is that if you put two organizations that they have the same goal in mind, the same vision, it is very easy to still find a solution for the problems. And that's something that we have also experienced in the last months. And I leave it here.
Right. No, thank you very much. I think, yeah, it's very, I think the learnings from this process will become kind of a experimental petri dish that can be escalated to other harmonization pathways. But like we mentioned, harmonization is not always necessary. I think we can work more on the interoperability. So bringing in this field, so carbon measures was also an announcement from last year. Tahmid, thank you so much for joining us. But you're a new name in that graph. But we also hope that you're willing to work in this framework towards interoperability. So please, I'll give you the floor to tell us more about carbon measures and how you're framing yourself in that.
Well, thank you, WorldSteel, first of all, for this opportunity to introduce carbon measures, and thank you, Felipe, for the introduction. I'll start with an apology from my colleague, Alex Saunders, who was supposed to be a part of this panel, but he had to be called away on a family emergency. So who is Carbon Measures? So Carbon Measures is a coalition of about 27 businesses with the goal of finding practical and realistic ways to reduce carbon emissions across a number of different sectors. And we think focusing on about 10 products, 10 sectors that cover about 70% of the energy emissions, energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, can be a big step. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? The problem that we're trying to solve is essentially a lot of our members and other companies have invested in low-carbon products, in low-carbon solutions, and yet they find that the demand for those products isn't out there. And even if the demand is there, the price that they would need to have at the market to be able to produce more of that and expand isn't there. So there's a lack of durable demand. At the same time, we see that those efforts towards decarbonization are not scaling up and speeding up at the rate and pace that we need to achieve the goals that were declared in Paris. So how do you get to that durable demand, and how do you get to that, that effort? So our members decided to get together and form Carbon Measures, these businesses that include representatives from fuels, chemicals, steel, but also banks and other institutions who work on the financing side of these products. And their thesis was simple. First, you need a very credible way to represent carbon, to account for carbon. If you can do that, if you can have the transparency, if you can have that verifiability of that data, that will lead to confidence that we're actually achieving what we want to achieve, which is carbon reductions. Once you have that, how do you activate then the market? And the way we're thinking of doing this is through product carbon intensity standards. So, and the word standards has different meanings for different folks. It could be just simply a label. It could be a threshold that you have to achieve. It could be a declining threshold that we have, for instance, in the fuel sector, where you have a carbon intensity that declines over time. And you could even overlay market principles on standards to have credit systems that allow some flexibility and liquidity and other things to happen. So all of that is par for the course. We can incorporate all of that. But what we intend to do is to have a dialogue with our members, but also the broader society of stakeholders to say, how do you get to that? What's the appropriate standard or system for your product in your sector? And you can only do that through appropriate dialogue. So the problem, the solution, ledger-based carbon accounting, along with hopefully at some point mandatory standards, and we'll talk more about why mandatory is important, and then doing this in a credible and inclusive way, bringing all stakeholders together, and we can talk about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think creating that market pool is something that many of these organizations are also looking to, but new approach can also provide different solutions for different stakeholders. But your very recent initiative, can you also mention, you've been assembling a highly technical panel of experts, so how is the work on that going? How do you see it going forward?
Absolutely. So alongside Carbon Measures, we had to think about how do you bring in different stakeholders, different voices, and you know, one of the issues that we've seen in the past is initiatives have failed when they have failed to include all of the voices that are needed at the table. So in terms of the idea of ledger-based carbon accounting, we felt that we needed to assemble the right team of folks. And so what we did is working with the International Chamber of Commerce, which is also actually a standards organization, we said we would assemble a technical expert panel. And that technical expert panel has started off. We have about 24 members spanning academia, NGOs, think tanks, businesses, representing the global north and the global south. So for instance, we have representatives from Oxford, Stanford, Tsinghua universities. We have several NGOs. We have also the former chair of the IPCC, a CEO, a CFO of Tata Steel is also part of our technical expert panel. So with that group of experts, we hope to outline what kind of accounting can be transparent, can be verifiable, and can actually work in the practical marketplace along the value chain to account for carbon as products move through various steps in the value chain all the way to the end consumer. So that's the approach. The technical expert panel will be working over the next few months to come up with their recommendations. And you know, the invitation here is to engage with us and give us your ideas and your thoughts as well, and we can make that part of the journey.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this approach to dialogue is what is needed. But like we discussed here, we've been doing a lot of work on carbon accounting for steel, so I hope that filters into the discussions taking place there as well. But I move on to Adina. Adina, with GSCC, you're one of the endorsing organizations for SSP as well, and you've been also starting now a review of your standards. So I'm interested in to hear your experience of GSCC, which is also a recent organization, I guess, from the last 3-4 years, I think. And how is the work in the SSP filtering into your revision and your plans going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Felipe, and thank you for this invitation. I appreciate it. So just to quickly introduce GSCC for those who don't know, but I think the majority in the room do know. So the Global Steel Climate Council was launched in late 2022 as a coalition of steel producers and their partners along the value chain to really focus on how do we align with the Paris Agreement, and how do we be ambitious and transparent on our journey towards a net zero future. So we don't only focus on product emission, certifying product emissions, although that is a focus of our program, but really is that we also want to focus on that decarbonization journey. So we have two components to our program that you don't see anywhere else, which is that our companies do set interim targets every 5 years to show incremental progress on that journey to 2050, and then they hold themselves accountable to meeting those interim targets, and then they can also certify their products. And the practical effect of it is it's a very dynamic program where, because they're taking corporate action and not just focusing on 1 or 2 sites within their portfolio, is that their product emissions are also in decline on a consistent basis. So the result is that we get real and practical results. And last year we had published that our first 4 certified companies had saved about 3 million tons of CO2. We'll announce this year's results later in the summer. But in terms of just, how did we set up our methodology, we did not reinvent the wheel at all, because we had existing programs in the world that were very effective in supporting emissions reporting, measurement reporting and verification. So we absolutely do incorporate all of the relevant ISO standards for both corporate accounting and product accounting. We definitely weave in the GHG protocol as much as possible. We did study compatriot programs to see why they were successful, and components that we wanted to incorporate into our program. And we did go through a stakeholder process and put together a standard that we believed would work the best for measurable results in the marketplace. And certainly we took a slightly different approach than others that we felt would suit all companies, no matter the production method and no matter where they sat in the world. And this was important because there are regional differences in raw material supply, in the energy mix, in obviously policy and regulatory environments, in transport. But we are starting to see more and more so that there is harmony in the fact that we're all starting to talk about measuring as CO2 equivalent. We're not just looking at CO2 only, but we're looking at all the greenhouse gases. All of us are looking at all the greenhouse gases. I think we're starting to coalesce around the organizational or product boundaries. Felipe had mentioned that in the steel standards principles, we have agreed that there is a common boundary at the crude steel phase, and we are all coming together to agree that we can measure at that spot, even where our program goes to hot rolling and others go beyond the crude phase. And we've all agreed that verification is an expectation now to help, create that trust in the data. But there are some key differences that exist, in our approaches. Some of them are going, may be insurmountable. Some of them may be solvable, but we do think about scrap inclusion a little bit differently. We're thinking about scope 2 accounting a little bit differently, and we're all sort of on tenterhooks about how the GHG protocol comes out on their scope 2 revisions. Allocation is also an issue that there isn't complete alignment on, and also not every program is aligned on how they account for upstream scope 3 emissions. I think that's starting to level out a little bit, but you could still use some more work. So it may not be that we all need to speak with the same voice. It's definitely that we have to speak with the same vocabulary. And we've worked on a glossary of terms within the steel standards principles. Yanet, you just mentioned that you're working on some terms as well. Hopefully we can marry that up with the steel standards principles, because I certainly wouldn't want our work to have been for naught and everybody's only turning to the GHG protocol, so we can talk with you on that. But having this, this alignment with existing standards, with the existing standards and existing frameworks, has allowed us to create such a strong standard in the GSCC that has allowed our companies to really deliver strong results to the market.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adina. It's a great response, and I think you touched upon some topics that I think I'll try to come back to if we have time. On the assurance side, I think there's a lot of work to do there. And on the part of the glossary, I think is also interesting. Our glossary even have a definition for alignment, because even the word alignment is not very clear, right? So if you ask 10 people, you have different definitions. But I'll go back to that point later. Now moving on to Annie. ResponsibleSteel has also been around for a few years as a worldsteel member and SSP endorser. But specifically on the aspect of interoperability, last year you also published some results on an exercise that you were analyzing interoperability with two other standards, with the less European standard and the C2F CISA standard in China. And I'm very interested to learn your findings from that exercise. If you could tell us a bit more.
Thanks, Felipe. Yeah, thanks for diving straight into the issue of the day, interoperability. I'm going to answer your question, but I just want to go back to the kind of context, the bigger, broader landscape. Because as you had in your slide earlier, ResponsibleSteel established its standard back in 2019, and I'm sure everyone knows that ResponsibleSteel is not only focused on carbon and climate, but the broader spectrum. We have 13 principles of sustainability. So our mission is really to drive the global industry to produce near zero emission steel that is both socially and environmentally responsible. So that is our broad mission. Now, the world is focused on greenhouse gases, but probably more on carbon actually than greenhouse gases, certainly in the steel industry. But we recognize that the way that standards are evolving, the way that the markets are evolving, we need some nimbleness to be able to at least tackle the greenhouse gas interoperability as a separate issue. And so we have agreed to work with similar schemes which are designed with a very similar philosophy around the decarbonisation of all technologies, no matter what your availability of iron ore and scrap is across the world. So we signed this MOU last November with the Brussels-based low-emission steel standard and the Chinese-based C2F standard. And they're both broadly similar to ours. This work that we've now embarked upon, and we're kind of, I would say, waist deep in right now, is not just about the methodologies. It's about the methodologies, how we count greenhouse gases. It's about the assurance, how we can create interoperable assurance. And it's about the claims that can be made around the level of decarbonisation. Because all of these three standards take a similar approach to showing progress on decarbonisation, no matter what technology you're using, no matter how much scrap you're using. Okay, so those are the three things. I think there's a fourth element, which is around disclosure, which ResponsibleSteel is very keen on driving a common set of metrics that are disclosed by these schemes, because they cover more than 60% of the world's production, these three schemes together. So if we can get that amount of steel actually disclosing on the same basis, then I think we've come a long way. The fifth element, which we're not yet addressing, but I think is really key to all of this, is once you've measured, once you've classified, once you've assured and made a claim, how do you pass that coil of steel down the value chain to your customer? And how does the customer make a claim that they are using some kind of low-emission steel? Do they know that the steel that arrived at their gate was the same steel that left the gate as a low-carbon product? Has that been traced, and how? So that's where downstream chain of custody comes in. I know the next panel is on chain of custody. I'm not going to go into that, but downstream chain of custody is quite a different thing, which we haven't, as an industry, I think, tackled yet. And that's really about the credibility of claims. Because ultimately, if you're a consumer of a car or a dishwasher and you want to use a low emissions product, how do you know that that product really is what it says it is? So during this work on interoperability with the C2F and the LESS standards, we've learned a lot of lessons, and I think it'd be, I just want to share three of them. The first is that the methodology interoperability is probably the easiest part. And yes, we're not necessarily going to reach harmonization on the methodologies, but we may do in specific circumstances, because it depends on what the purpose is. Right now, where we are is we've agreed that we can't just convert from ResponsibleSteel decarbonisation progress level 2 is equivalent to the LESS class B, for example, or the C2F level E, for example. We can't do that because we need to go back to the numbers, count the numbers, and make sure the numbers correspond. And that's where you go back to the methodologies. So what we thought we would create a conversion tool with each of these organizations. We, in fact, have created a co-calculation tool. So the steelmaker will be able to plug their numbers in, what their input materials are, what their energy consumption is, and the grid emissions factor, et cetera, and the upstream. And then out of the tool will come a number, and that will be your emissions intensity number, and that then will be classified by the different schemes, a Class E, a DPL2, for example. So the harmonization isn't happening yet, but we can co-calculate. And that at least saves the steelmaker a job of having to do it twice. So that's the first thing. On the methodologies, though, the work in sitting down with these organizations and working through the differences in methodologies that Adina has actually outlined quite clearly, I think, has been really, really instrumental in driving better understanding. So I'll give you one example. We've been talking with the Chinese Iron and Steel Association for 3 years or so. And during that time, the C2F standard came out, and it was really starting at the steel mill and finishing at crude steel. They now allow, they have an additional set of classifications for a hot rolled product, and that's similar to what the LESS standard does. But they recognize the crude steel cutoff is the valuable one because it enables that comparison of any site anywhere in the world. And that's why I think why the steel standards principles, all the organizations have realized that that's an essential data point to have. The other is the upstream boundary. Now, the steel standards principles has established the necessity of measuring emissions from mine to crude steel at a minimum. The C2F standard recently has announced that they're going to extend their boundary upstream to cover mining emissions. And that's really significant. When it comes to Caroline's question yesterday of what's the denominator? Is it CO2 or is it greenhouse gases? Is it just the steel side, or does it include the methane emissions from coal mining? In terms of climate impact, that makes a massive difference. So the steel standard principles have established that, and I really congratulate everyone involved in that to establish that kind of agreement. And we are seeing it playing out in these different standards. So yes, the methodologies are different, but we are starting to align more. No, we can't do conversion, but we can do co-calculation. I think the third difference, the third learning that we've got is you've got to look at what the purpose of the standard is. And many people have said this, but let's just kind of unpack that for a minute. If the standard is promoting trade in low-emission steel in order to create markets, which I think Dan has very eloquently described, that's what we need to be doing, then we need a product-based standard. If we want to be able to trace and track progress globally on decarbonisation, then I think we need a site-based standard and a corporate-based standard. And the corporate number should be the sum of all the sites. But I tell you, if you add up all the products, that doesn't add up to the same as the corporate or the site. And why? Because you have allocation. And what does allocation mean? A site has, let's say, 20% renewable energy. Can they allocate that 20% to 100% of a batch of steel products or 100% of a production line? Can they allocate it freely? Or do they need to take the average emissions factor for their electricity and allocate it evenly across all their products? So when you're buying something that is made with 100% renewable energy, how does that work? So that's about accounting rules, it's about allocation rules. And different standards have different allocation rules. So we need to agree on whether that's allowed and how that's allowed and do that consistently. So far, with the transparency principles, we are asking for transparency from the different methodologies over how that works. But I think we need to get to an agreement on, actually, let's agree on those rules. And the work with the GHG protocol and ISO, I think, is really, really instructive here for all of us. So site versus product. And yesterday it came up around the difference between the ECS, which is production line or site-based ultimately, and the CBAM, which allows some allocation. So if we can get alignment across those things, this will make life so much easier. But we need that product-based standard. We need that product-based alignment in order to drive the market and the demand signals. But we also need to be able to track the site-based progress, because if we don't, we'll end up with a world in which a small niche market exists for low-emission steel, and the rest is business as usual. And I tell you, if you look across Forest Stewardship Council, or even the eco-label that you have on your fridges and dishwashers, you're talking about, well, I just asked ChatGPT actually this morning, what percentage of dishwashers are grades A on the eco-label in Europe? And the answer came back, not many. I think it's 1 to 3%. Then I said, what about grades A, B, or C? And they said, oh, about 25%. And that's a similar number to what you find with those really well-established certification systems like Forest Stewardship Council, about 20-25%. Is that what we want, or do we want to decarbonize the entire industry? So I think ultimately we need both.
Thank you very much, Annie. Yeah, I agree. Especially a lot of the companies that are here, they have set their own net zero targets, and that's usually traced via organizational accounting and site-based accounting. That won't be traced via product. So there is a place for that. So they will coexist. And I think it goes back to your finding on the co-calculation tool, because the underlying data is the same, like Dan just mentioned before. Even if you're doing those two calculations, the base, the foundation of the data is the same. So how can we harmonize at least on that front? And that will go to the person that's actually doing that. So very happy to follow that up with Nick. Nick, you're from the industry perspective, you have all these standards bodies and different frameworks to report to and to prepare data for. And they're all supported by different steel companies, so there's a place for them. But how you, as a steel producer operating in different regionalities, how do you position yourself in that market and put a transparent message across to your clients and stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you, MACIEL and Felipe. We basically operate in a team that undertakes these kind of assessments for our products and processes. So I'll try and give a bit of a perspective as to what that means on a kind of day-to-day basis and how we actually go about managing that. So when you look at these different schemes, I think just going back through the history of it, and I think your slide, Felipe, outlined how things have progressed over time with the development of the ISO standards back in the 90s through to sort of the 14067 standards on product carbon footprinting. And so as steel companies and as World Steel as well, we've seen that evolution and growth in the number of standards and therefore expectations from the markets or regulators or from other bodies of what data they would like us to report and to what standards. So there's some, as a steel producer who operates in different geographies, we have teams who manage these kind of complexities in the different geographies and providing these sort of data. I think, Annie, you highlighted something that I was going to bring out as well, is often there's a good reason why these different systems exist. So we would call that the golden scope. So what is the intention or what's the logic behind that scope? Is it organizational accounting? Is it product accounting? Is it something to do with trade? And therefore, we have to sort of recognize that there probably will always be this need to report different numbers for different reasons. So as a steel producer, how do we kind of reconcile this level of complexity with different schemes and different needs and different requirements? And I think you can sort of unpack that by thinking, well, okay, what's the system boundary? If we can make a system boundary large enough and we can collect the data and have that data verified once for that enlarged system boundary at sufficiently high level of granularity, then that should be sufficient as a plug-in to all these different methodologies. So the methodologies are independent of the data that you collect from your steel plant. The data that you collect in the verification and having that, verified to a high level, sort of kind of things like ETS, for example, have MRV systems for how you account for your emissions at a process level and have a high level of assurance of that. And then applying that, those emissions and storing those emissions centrally and applying those to the different methods is how you unravel some of that complexity. Having said that, I think there is still this need for it helps to have some level of interoperability. So if we do have interoperability between schemes, and there are these tools that enable us to translate, once we've got the raw input data between these different schemes, then that's definitely going to help the steel producers generally, rather than having to have the kind of scenario where essentially you have 20, 30 different ways that you need to report the data, and each of those require you to go back to the individual meter and have that verified. The amount of verification and assurance of all that level of data is just enormous, and the amount of time and effort that a company would have to put into that is just unimaginable, really. So in our organization, we take the similar sort of approach in that we store the data centrally in a system, and then we apply that to these different methodologies. So that's how we're currently managing, but certainly there's more that we can do to make it interoperable, and through the initiatives of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as well, having some common ways of how we apply, for example, the counting of electricity is highly important. So we need that all to come together to kind of ease the pain in that sense. So thanks.
Yeah, no, that's it's very interesting. Bringing back what Ed yesterday mentioned. So he's going over 300 spreadsheets to make the reports. But if you multiply that for the multiple schemes, then the amount of work is just unsurmountable and inefficient, to be frank. But how can we? So I understand that from the data perspective, if it's a data problem, yeah, an technology company can come in and say, okay, I offer you a system that will collect your data. But if each individual company is doing this as well and doing the recalculations themselves, then that also doesn't bring a lot of transparency, because can we track that comparison is there? So should there be something outside of the company level that will have some data hub on the industry level that allows for that information to be comparable, recalculated for these different approaches, something that I think we should think about. But I think it was touched upon a few other points on the GHG protocol and ISO work. The GHG protocol side specifically, you're also undergoing Scope 2 review, Scope 3 review, changing some of the requirements. And there's a new proposal of a quite interesting standard, the Action and Markets Instrument, that I thought maybe you just mentioned. How is that filtering into the GHG protocol ISO partnership, if it is or not, or yeah, please.
Sure, happy to elaborate that. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have 3 main standards that we are developing within this partnership: corporate, product, and project. If we take a look into the corporate standard, we have 4 different work streams that are currently working on the development of the working drafts, and they are addressing different topics. And we have exactly those topics that you have mentioned. So we have the corporate standard on the very general requirements that a corporate needs to follow. We have the Scope 2 requirements, and also the action market instruments. So these are not just happening in parallel, but these are actually part of the partnership. And the way that we are integrating these aspects is that we are also assessing, well, how are these topics interconnected with product-level accounting and project-level accounting? If we're thinking specifically, for example, of the AMI work, the action market and action market instruments, this is very specific to project standards as well. So we are really trying to make this as comprehensive as possible, and it's obviously very complicated because it's very complex, right? But we want to make sure that all the different developments that are happening in different work streams are also being considered in the other standards because of the purpose of interoperability, right? So we don't want to have the scenario where corporate standards saying something for Scope 2 emissions and then product saying completely the opposite. So what we are trying to do is also within the working groups to have that dialogue frequently to understand what are these discussions happening, having joint sessions with the working groups as well for this understanding. And well, this is obviously part that we have in our minds, that we want to make sure that we are all aligned as much as possible. And yeah, this is part of the work as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's very refreshing to see that you have that connection between the product and the organization and projects, because you have cross communication, so trying to keep everybody aligned, but it's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen across those functions. And just before I move, I would like to go into a broader discussion on this aspect of the data being, how do we reduce that compliance burden? But I would not. I would like to give the floor to carbon measures because I think you're proposing a different approach. That's carbon ledger accounting, based on some study that was published before from Harvard. But as we discussed before, you said it's not exactly what was published. You're still looking into it. But I think because it's a new concept, I think we should just bring it to the floor as well.
So can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to focus on in carbon measures is really that accounting piece. How do you take the data which is available at a facility or a plant and apply it with the highest level of confidence, traceability, verifiability? And the approach that we've been thinking about is, or applying the same kind of financial principles, general accounting principles that have been used widely in the financial sector to carbon. The double bookkeeping system, a balance sheet, if you will, of carbon, flows and stocks, that kind of application at each gate to gate, and then following that down the supply chain from the mine face, if you like, and down to the different levels of production all the way to the consumer. If you could have that kind of a system, then the data is there. How you apply the data, and Nick alluded to that, the data is there. And in most sectors and most industries, you have that kind of data available. If you can then take that data and put it into this kind of accounting framework, you can then hopefully, if you design specifically the accounting system with interoperability in mind, use that for product level intensity representations, building it up to corporate or entity level or project level, as my colleague from GAGP was alluding to. The key there is having, and Dan said the right words, confidence, accuracy, transparency, traceability, and interoperability, and having that kernel of data available. You alluded to the fact that there are IT platforms or companies who will be able to take that and apply that to whatever representation is needed. So that's not primary challenge. The primary challenge is how do you structure that so that that data is usable in multiple different fashions. And that final piece of following it down the value chain, up and down the value chain, addresses the question of downstream chain of custody, or upstream, if you like, of how do you pass that information, carbon information on, along with the product. The carbon information flows down down the value chain. So that's the approach. We think it's a approach that will work with all of these other representations, disclosures, regulatory systems. But I'll say that it does require a lot of, will require work. It's not going to be easy. And it will require dialogue so that we're not repeating and creating more confusion versus harmonizing and simplifying. Yeah.
This is that part of tracking it down the value chain. I think Annie mentioned as well, but I think the key aspect there would be, okay, what's the threshold for efficiency? Because if you go down to SMEs, then the amount of effort that you require from small players in that value chain, how do we make sure that they are integrated, or what level of assurance would you recommend, or estimation will be allowed? It's something that we'll have to keep track. But it is an interesting proposition. So with the caveat that you use the accounting principles that we are discussing on the SSP, I think it's a good effort to go forward. And all these initiatives that we have here are voluntary initiatives, but we also have the regulatory. So we had a discussion yesterday about the pricing schemes, and they're also involving assurance, some verification. So I just wanted to bring this maybe to Adina and to Annie to reply, but on your processes of verification and assurance, how do you see that happening? Okay, CBAM is going into a verification period soon. A lot of the companies will undergo the effort, although, as we discussed yesterday, there's a lot of uncertainties there. The data and the boundaries are not exactly the same, but a lot of the data is common, right? So the data points, the original foundational data is the same. Can some of that compliance burden be lifted from those actions? Maybe Adina and then Annie.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, just this question of data is probably one of the most important questions that we're facing, because ultimately that's what the market, that's what the governments, that's what the investors are asking for, as we've all already alluded to, is just fundamentally what's the embedded emissions in this piece of steel, or in the final product, but in the all of the components that are incorporated in that final product. And, you know, for steel producers, just from a steel producer perspective, but really from any company that makes a product, it used to be that they just needed the data, but now we need the data, we need to trust that data. And so, you know, for us, it's, you know, I think the three most important things that we need to maybe improve access to more primary data, or to build up a system where we can maybe rely on a greater share of primary data than we have access to right now, is number one is we need to create better incentives for investing in data collection systems or hiring people to do that. You know, the biggest struggle, I think, just from a steel producer perspective, the biggest struggle, of course, is in their own Scope 3 upstream supply chain, where you have a lot of small players who don't have the sophistication to understand how to calculate, let alone to understand why it is that they're calculating. And so we see a lot of our companies actually doing some of the practical training, you know, with their suppliers, just for some of the basic data that they need to do. But how do you incentivize them to just, you know, take on that work on their own, because it's such a growing field that we need that underlying data. Second of all, this has come up, and in kind of randomly in different spots, but obviously the digitalization and traceability of data will certainly help us to improve the quality and the trust in that data. That again is also going to be hard, again, just from a steel producer's perspective, from their Scope 3, from, you know, many of their raw material suppliers. But as the systems are building out, how do we incentivize them to participate? But a lot of that will require safety measures, of course, for the protection of that data, which I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation, is creating, it's not just trust, but the providers of the data also need trust that their data is being protected. And then also the third piece would be that the verification systems that are being used are practical and proportionate for what is being used here. So I don't know that I have an example of a verification system that isn't proportionate, but I think we just need to keep, you know, in mind that for small suppliers, that the verification isn't too onerous, so that they're willing to participate in such a system. And, you know, there is a continued role for secondary data for the time being, because we can't, you know, fix that overnight. But we can certainly put ourselves on the right path. And I think we also just need to continuously replace generic assumptions, like ICU, EU, with your default values. Some of those need to be readjusted, I think, for certain policies. But you know, and rely more on measured info. But I think, you know, we're starting to see the trends there towards getting to more accurate data. But what we do at GSCC is we just ask our companies to disclose how much of their data is primary versus secondary, so that we understand that. So that's how I wanted to start with a reply to that
You know,
question.
that data quality discussion, I think, like I mentioned, even in WordSteel, we're also having that conversation. And I'm not sure, I'm also conscious of the time, maybe to open for questions, but please, if you have...
Sure,
something to
I
contribute.
think this verification question is really, really important. There are many different kinds of verification. Most verification involves an audit, and it should involve an audit, an independent audit. That's a really key principle. Beyond that, is that auditor audited ever? Right? Do you know that that auditor has a conflict of interest or not? Do you know that they're well qualified? Do you know that they're doing it in a way that's calibrated with the next auditor at a different site? Because if you don't know any of that, you've really no ability to trust the outcome. This is what we have in financial accounting. This is what we need in greenhouse gas verification. That's why ResponsibleSteel calls it assurance, because it's a whole system. We have oversight over the auditors. We ensure the auditors are qualified, and then we oversee them. And if issues are raised, we'll go and dig into it. But as a matter of course, we have various mechanisms of oversight. So that's a really key question. It is about data quality and it's about trust in data, but we've also got to have quality of verification. As I said at the beginning, a very key part of our interoperability program is working on interoperable assurance. So if we see a site that has been verified to the LESS standard or the C2F standard, how much do we trust their assurance system, and how much do we think we actually need to add an additional layer? So that's what we are discussing with both of those organizations. Ultimately, the goal is one data set, next data set, two methodologies, hopefully one interoperable assurance system, so that you've actually got one data set, one audit, and two outcomes. Maybe three outcomes. Maybe you throw the CBAM in there as well. So if we can actually, I do think we need an international agreement on interoperable assurance as much as we do on interoperable measurement standards.
Yeah, and I think that's what Dan mentioned before, the open coalition of carbon markets can also be something to bring in that regulatory side to the voluntary aspect that can be integrated. But I would like to open for questions from the floor as well, just if any hands up, please. Yeah, that.
Hey, good morning. I don't know if does this work? Yes, okay. I'm Piedad from IKEA, and I would like to add a little bit the point of view from the final customer. Well, not the final, because final customer is each one of our customers, but IKEA as a customer, we are dealing with, you presented very well in your slide, with this universe of standards. So I don't know who to place this question, but when do you think the final customer, as us, could have comparable numbers and something as simple as EPDs, for instance? When do you think that EPD A1, A3 could be comparable among different companies, different regions? When do you think this will happen? I know you don't have a glass ball. Difficult question, I know.
Yeah, I mean, so you've identified one use case of the kind of data that we have, and EPDs is one of those. So many of the steel companies provide and produce EPDs. So those are kind of data sets that are already available. I think your question is then, are they trustworthy? Is that your?
No. I don't have a question about if they are trustable or not. My question is if they are comparable. Because simpler byproduct allocation is not clear how the byproduct allocation is or can be done. So when we get a number from an EPD from steel mill X and a number from a steel mill Y, we don't really know if they are fully comparable, even though they are done according to the EPD methodology. But this is the dilemma that the customers have.
Maybe I'll just mention as well. So this is one aspect that we did in the transparency form in the SSP, which is, okay, if you're publishing your EPD, your method for allocation, you should describe it. But even if you describe, if they're described and they're different, then they're not comparable. So the problem remains. But I'll leave for...
Yeah, so you're talking about things like a treatment of allocation for byproducts and things like that. So that is something where program operators, for example, have approaches that they use and apply those approaches. There are different program operators, so they may not all follow the same kind of approach. If you're talking about program operators operate EN 15804, for example, that you have these different kind of approaches. So at WorldSteel, we're trying to with WorldSteel, we're trying to develop some common measures of how you would apply allocation, and that's something that we're very much working towards to help guide these program operators as to what the common measure is, and that will be something that we've been actively working on and hope to announce shortly under the banner of SAMCO.
I'll just add, I thoroughly agree that this is a real problem, and because you have these different program operators, you've got these differences. So we need to bring them together. ResponsibleSteel has done some work with Nick and other steel companies to look at, if you put the same numbers in to these different standards, you know, why are there differences? And you cannot compare EPDs, as you say. That's one of the conclusions, sadly. But there are signs that the EPD platform operators are starting to work together, and there are MOUs emerging between different EPD platforms operators, so that when they generate a new PCR, then they can actually be working together. But these, you know, there's no regulation ultimately. There's no regulatory body. So I think that there is a real issue there. So we can't give a timeline of when that's going to be solved.
Yeah, also from our perspective, I would love to have a number, 5 years, 10 years, we're gonna have the answer, but obviously we don't know yet. I think what's important right now is for us to focus in the foundation methodology, for us to have it right and make it as applicable as possible. Obviously we talked about different use cases, so that's something we need to take into account. But the foundation needs to be developed and be as, you know, transparent, interoperable, and all of the different important aspects that we discussed. And then a very important topic for EPDs is product category rules. So how are this going to be involved into this process? Are they going to be updated accordingly? I think yes. When is this going to happen? Well, sadly we don't have a timeline, but definitely something that we need to talk about with the different stakeholders, and that's also one of the reasons why we try to make a space during the standard development process to also include different stakeholders, to also listen their perspectives and make sure that there is dialogue also for these type of use cases.
Any other questions? Please.
I'm coming from the chemical industry, actually, so from another sector. I'll just give you one experience or one story from the automotive sector. Yeah. We are providing plastics, the steel industry is providing steel, and maybe other industries are providing other materials. So think about now a brand like you, or an OEM, in the automotive case, like a Mercedes, like a BMW, he wants to choose materials. And he wants to compare not only steel against another steel, he wants to compare steel against plastics, or plastics against whatever, wood even. Yeah? So now it's coming to the rules, how you calculate, in the end, a carbon footprint between different sectors. That's even more difficult. And we tried this exercise with Catena X. I think you mentioned that Catena X initiative with BMWs and so on. And we came to the conclusion it's not comparable. Yeah. And on the other hand, if we as in the chemical industry are at the beginning of the value chain, the same like for you in steel, think about the ESPR regulation now in Europe. We don't want to calculate for one application in this way, for the other application another way. We want to calculate the same way for all applications. So for me, the only solution is that we have a common ground in the end, and that's a common harmonization, and a common harmonization not only in one program operator and an EPD, or one region, or it must be global. And therefore, I fully support this ISO Greenhouse Gas Protocol initiative. That's something which is on the top, where we try to make common rules across sectors, across regions. And then we can also drop down maybe product categories which are more specific for steel, maybe for plastics, maybe for others, where we can really comprehensively see how do you calculate that, and maybe there are some specifics where we see some differences. We don't have that. Currently, the standardization is completely fragmented. And I think Dan has shown a very nice landscape showing that the fragmentation of standards in the end. Yeah? And I would like to know maybe some comments from you. I just have given you my interpretation of that, but maybe you also comment from your side, from the steel perspective.
So, yeah, I suppose we talked about EPDs as that was a nice example that you gave, and obviously that's covering a lot of environmental indicators beyond just the CO2 or the product carbon footprint. So you have this additional layer of complexity as to what builds up within an EPD. I think you mentioned the example of more like a PCF, so just reporting the carbon figure, and that's done in the context of a product carbon footprint, which is different from the kind of framework that EPDs operate under. So if, as you say, if we can have some common rules for accounting across sectors, that absolutely makes sense, and doing that in the context of a product carbon footprint with the GHG protocol and having some common rules. If that's the kind of market need, is rather than the full suite of environmental indicators that you have in an EPD would be a product carbon footprint as another use case, then certainly the GHG protocol and the ISO standards on product carbon footprinting and the alignment of those is that route for that particular use case of the data. So yeah, I think that was...
And maybe I'll add that I do think if we can get down to an asset level, facility level, carbon accounting, applying those financial principles, I think we can have a better read across. And this could be applied not just to steel, but to chemicals, to all sorts of fundamental commodity products. Then there would be a better read across. And hopefully we can all work together to better align on some of this. And actually, we've have now liaison, Carbon Measures has liaison status with the ISO, and so hopefully we'll be able to work together and have that dialogue to see if we can apply these not just sector by sector, but across sectors, and have more of a global approach to this versus the fragmentation that Dan showed us quite graphically. Thank you. Yeah.
I think I would take another question, but we're running out of time. I think I would be remiss just if I don't give... is there another one? Yeah, please, Edwin.
Thanks, Felipe. A very, very simple question. We're all saying the same thing, basically. We need some coordination, some alignment, whatever we want to call it, and we're all very polite with each other. What is the one thing that we can do from today onwards that will take this one step forward? I don't get a sense that we know precisely what is the next step other than more and more polite discussion. But what's the one thing we can do?
Anybody take it?
Well, I would say, at least from our perspective, is the work of the Steel Standards Principles, I think, is very active. We have made pledges for for example, our transparency form. So we are implementing that, or our companies are implementing that. Our standard is under review. This is a regular component of the process of our program. International standards always go through reviews to make sure that we're keeping up with international practice and markets. And of course, because our foundational standards are themselves under review, we want to make sure that we're staying aligned with those. And by the way, you're all welcome to submit comments. Just go to our website, and it's very, very easy to submit comments to our standard. And one of the core components that's on our list is to ensure that we do have all of the alignment frameworks coming out of the steel standards principles. So we're going to take a look at all of those. And that's how we're going to strengthen the GSCC Steel Climate Standard, is not only are we answering certain questions in the market, and are we aligning with the updates coming to the GHG protocol, as well as the alignment that they're doing with the ISO, but are we incorporating the initiatives that we're taking in the steel standards principles, such as on transparency, such as on the common reporting boundary, such as on some of the words in our glossary, all of those sort of things, and I think we're not the only program that's doing that, but those are steps that a lot of our members are taking to move forward in the alignment space. As a group, we just have to keep coming up with those ideas and to move ahead. But there is a lot of activity, as Annie has also, described in her space, but there is a lot of activity that we are taking seriously that's coming out of that process.
Yeah, I think I would mention the work in the SSP. Like I mentioned before, I would love that we could do just a montage and go fast and show, okay, this is now resolved, but unfortunately that work is, it takes time, right? So it's sitting down and actually seeing the discussions. But just I'll give Yanet just a brief opportunity to say how can the companies engage in the GHG ISO harmonization, because we're running out of time.
Happy to, and also thank you very much for the question, because the momentum is now, right? And we're just talking about we want to achieve this, but we need to get this work doing already today. So how can you be engaged? So we have different working groups that are already running. So one option for you is to assess whether you are able to join one of these working groups. So please feel free to talk to me just right after this meeting, and we can talk about the options that we have, either joining through ISO, national standard bodies, or to GHGP. And then something that we also do is public consultations. So currently we have the request for information for the Action Market Instruments white paper. So in case you are interested into anything related to chain of custody, market-based topics, please take a look into this document. We have this open until June 15, so you can just read it, submit your comments, and this is the best way for us to also get the perspectives from the sector. Further public consultations are coming up next, so also please just be, you can sign the newsletters. That's the way where we share the public consultations when they're opened, but also through our social media. So I fully encourage you to engage with this process, because this is happening now, so we really want you to make sure that we get all the perspective from the room.
And from the sector side, please engage with the steel standards principles. I think that's the place for us to have that discussion. But
Felipe, can I add?
Yeah, please.
I'm just going to take this away from responsible steel and even away from standards and talk about trade, because ultimately we've got sites around the world that have been designed, low emission steel making technology, that can't get final investment decision. And why? Because the demand signal isn't firm enough. Why is it not firm enough? You can bring it back to standards, but ultimately that steel needs to be traded. So it's got to involve governments, to your question, Edwin. It's got to involve governments getting up to speed and seeing how they can facilitate that trade with climate in mind. So we need climate-based trade agreements. I think that's the fundamental thing that we need to be looking for and encouraging governments to think about. Alice yesterday from the IIST asked everybody, what does the industry want? What do you want from your government? Surely you want your governments to facilitate trade in low emission steel. And when governments get involved, yes, they've got many, many priorities, but unfortunately a lot of the definitions of low emission steel are getting caught up with all sorts of other political priorities. But we've got to focus on, if we're trying to drive decarbonisation of the industry for the sake of the climate, we've got to focus on climate-based trade.
As long as you have both environment and trade ministers involved in those discussions, which doesn't always happen.
A lot of dialogue is needed, of course. But please join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think we go now for the coffee break, of course. Thank you.